They wore the uniform with pride. They swore an oath to protect and serve. But their trust was shattered. The Coast Guard, tasked with protecting our shores, became a breeding ground for abuse.
Victims of sexual assault and harassment bravely stepped forward. They shared their harrowing experiences before the Senate Homeland Security Committee.
Their voices, raw with pain and anger, painted a grim picture. They exposed a deeply rooted culture of abuse within the Coast Guard. These were not isolated incidents. A pattern of systemic failures came to light. Reports were ignored, perpetrators were protected, victims were silenced. The Coast Guard, sworn to protect, had failed its own.
Their testimonies were not just stories of individual trauma. They revealed a betrayal of trust at the highest level. The very institution meant to protect them had become their tormentor.
Their courageous stand demanded justice, it demanded accountability, it demanded change. The nation listened, heartbroken and outraged. The Senate Homeland Security Committee's report was damning. It revealed a disturbing truth. The Coast Guard had become a breeding ground for sexual predators. The report detailed the experiences of countless victims. Their stories were chillingly similar. Reports of assault were ignored or mishandled. Perpetrators faced few consequences for their actions. The report exposed a systemic failure to address sexual assault within the Coast Guard. It highlighted the lack of accountability for perpetrators. It criticized the inadequate support systems for victims. The report served as a stark reminder. The Coast Guard was failing its members. The findings were a wake-up call for the nation. It forced a long overdue reckoning. The Coast Guard, entrusted with protecting our waters, had become a danger to its own. The report demanded immediate and decisive action. The time for empty promises was over. The safety and well-being of Coast Guard members hung in the balance. Megan Laurie Clement, a former Coast Guard lieutenant, shared her story. She was drugged and raped by a superior officer. Her report was ignored, her career was derailed, her life was forever changed.
Julian Bell, a Coast Guard veteran, recounted his experience of being sexually assaulted by a fellow officer. He suffered in silence, fearing retaliation. His story was a testament to the pervasive fear that silenced so many victims.
Crystal Van den Heuvel, a former Coast Guard member, spoke about the relentless harassment she endured. Her complaints were dismissed. She was labeled a troublemaker. Her career stalled.
Shauna Christine Ward, a Coast Guard veteran, detailed the sexual assault she suffered while stationed in Alaska. She was ostracized for reporting the incident. Her career suffered. Her trust in the Coast Guard was shattered.
These brave survivors, each with their own harrowing story, shared a common experience. They were failed by the very institution sworn to protect them. Section 4. Ignoring the alarm systemic issues and lack of accountability. The Coast Guard had a problem. That problem was a deeply ingrained culture of silence and denial. Reports of sexual assault were often ignored or downplayed. Victims were discouraged from coming forward. Perpetrators were rarely held accountable. The lack of accountability was appalling. It sent a dangerous message. Sexual assault would be tolerated. The system was rigged against the victims. It protected the abusers. This created an environment of fear and intimidation. The systemic issues ran deep. The investigation process was flawed. Support for victims was inadequate. The Coast Guard had failed to protect its own. The consequences were devastating. Lives were shattered. Careers were destroyed. Trust was broken. Victims were left feeling betrayed and abandoned. They were left to pick up the pieces of their lives. The Coast Guard had a moral obligation to address these systemic failures. Silence was not an option. Action was long overdue. Section 5. A glimmer of hope, proposed reforms met with skepticism. In response to the outcry, the Coast Guard proposed reforms. They promised to overhaul their policies. They vowed to improve support for victims. They pledged to hold perpetrators accountable. But skepticism lingered. Promises had been made before, yet little had changed. Victims and their advocates demanded more than just words. They demanded action. They demanded concrete changes. They demanded a cultural shift. They demanded a Coast Guard where everyone felt safe. The proposed reforms, while a step in the right direction, were met with caution. Victims had heard it all before. They had seen promises broken. They had experienced the pain of indifference. The Coast Guard had a long way to go to rebuild trust. Only tangible actions would prove their commitment to change. The time for empty gestures was over. The time for real action was now. Section 6. A call for justice, demanding change and a safer Coast Guard. The testimonies of the brave survivors echoed throughout the nation. They served as a stark reminder. Sexual assault was a pervasive problem. The Coast Guard was not immune. These were not isolated incidents. They were symptoms of a broken system. The call for justice resonated. It demanded accountability. It demanded a cultural shift. It demanded a safer Coast Guard. The time for change was long overdue. The Coast Guard had a choice to make. They could cling to the status quo, or they could choose a different path. They could choose to honor their oath. They could choose to protect their own. The nation watched and waited. The demand for justice echoed. The hope for a safer Coast Guard flickered. The time for action was now.